Welcome to 10 Point Turns, a channel created to spark discussion and provide education in the competitive scene of Warhammer, Age of Sigmar. In this AoS Explained series, I'm going to be covering key concepts and ideas that are essential to understand the conversations held in the competitive space. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date on the series. Today's topic is screens. To start, what does that even mean? The word screen is often used to refer to a unit that is controlling space. While a screening unit can control space, it often does so to protect more valuable units, hold objectives, and prevent deep strike. Screens are also usually cheap in points, have poor saves, and a low health characteristic. Some examples of screens across armies include Blood Reavers from Blades of Khorne, Steel Helms from Cities of Sigmar, and Clan Rats from the Skaven faction. There are plenty of other examples of screens across most armies, and some armies fill those roles in different ways. In Sons of Behemoth, there is such a low model count across the army that the closest unit to a screen would be a Man-Crusher Gargant, which definitely has a poor save and is pretty cheap, but doesn't control as much space as, say, a unit of 20 Clan Rats. Some armies will not leave home without 2 to 3 screens, and some will not bother bringing screens at all. It all depends on what the army wants to do, and a big part of that is what the army needs to do. We will talk about list compositions and where screens fall in that later in this video. First, we need to address how screens control space. Age of Sigmar at its core is a movement game. All of the fighting and shooting and destroying your opponent's units is a great time, but games are won and lost based on how you move your units around the board. The 3 main things a screen can do is protect your other units, hold your objectives, and prevent your deep strikes. Holding objectives is the easiest concept of these 3 to execute. Simply put, you move your screen unit onto any objective between you and your opponent, or leave a cheap screen on your home objective in order to prevent your opponent from being able to take it from you. Preventing deep strike is also simple in concept, but more difficult in execution. All units that start in strategic reserve and want to be set up on the battlefield must be set up more than 9 inches away from any opposing units. So each model in your screening unit can control a space as large as a circle with a 9-inch radius around its base. If you have a unit of 20, you now control 20 overlapping 9-inch radius circles that prevent deep strike. It is very powerful when dealing with an enemy that uses deep strike regularly, like the Stormcast Eternals or Skaven factions. Lastly, and most importantly, screens exist to protect your more valuable units. Let's talk about some examples where screening is very important. Some armies have incredibly impressive shooting. A prime example of this is the new Skaven weapons teams, primarily Scourgers and Rattling Cannons. These new ranged threats can delete most units and heavily damage even the very durable ones. The downside to these units is their own durability and the lack of ability to shoot in combat. So if the enemy can charge and get into combat with your Scourgers, they render them effectively useless for the few short moments they will remain on the battlefield. They cannot be saved once they get engaged in combat. So how does one protect these kinds of units? By using a screen. The Skaven faction has access to one of the strongest screens in Age of Sigmar 4th edition. Clan Rats have 20 models with 1 health apiece and 5 up save. They can control a ton of space in front of and around the Scourgers. That way they can keep the shooting unit safe for at least a turn, while the Scourgers continue to shoot and offer covering fire. Screens have changed largely with the new addition. With all units having a 3-inch combat range, you have to be much more careful with where you place your valuable units. So, where should I put my screen? How far up should it be? Should my valuable unit live right behind it? All of these questions can be directly answered by understanding the threat range of your opponent's units. Let's cover the 3 most common ways I would arrange my screening units. The easiest screening to accomplish is against units with no double fight abilities in the combat phase. As long as the enemy unit cannot get his base within 3 inches of your valuable unit, that is how far forward I would screen my units at a minimum. Looking at the shown example, the enemy cannot get any of his units within 3 inches of my valuable unit, and therefore it has been screened effectively. Screening starts to get difficult when working with double fighting units. To clarify, a unit with a double fight is any unit with an ability to fight a second time in the same combat phase, but it has to strike last for the second fight, an example being Chaos Chosen from the Slaves to Darkness faction. To completely screen out a unit with this ability, your valuable unit will need to be more than 6 inches away from the double fighting unit. This is because you need to account for a second 3-inch pile-in that occurs during the second fight. Reminder, this is more than 6 inches away from the closest that unit can get during the first pile-in. The final situation is screening against shooting units. If you are dealing with units with a shorter range, 12 inches or less, you can play your screen slightly more than 9 inches in front of the unit you are protecting. However, once you are dealing with shooting ranges around 18 inches and greater, I would focus more on using obscuring terrain to protect valuable units, since controlling upwards of 24 inches of space with only a couple of units can be very difficult. So, how good are screening units in 4th edition Age of Sigmar? Honestly, not great. In addition, where less units are on the battlefield due to point increases, some armies can't afford a true screening unit in their 2,000 point competitive list. Another major reason is power through. Power through is a generic command that can be used at the end of the turn by a unit that has charged. Deals D3 damage to a unit with a lower health characteristic, then allows the unit chosen to make a move up to its move characteristic in any direction, even leaving combat but not entering a new combat. But why is that so good, especially against screening units? Power through has really stripped a lot of the stronger screening units of their power. A lot of the better screening units either do something when they die, like mortal damage on a die roll, or are much stickier than anticipated, and can really tie up an enemy unit for longer than they should. An example of the former is Disciple of Tzeentch's Pink Horrors, doing mortal damage on a 4-up for each model that dies, or Maggotkin and Nurgle's Plague Bearers, with a 5-up ward making them require a much larger commitment than your opponent may realize. With power through, there is no worry for your enemy with screens. If they didn't kill the whole unit, they can just power through in any direction, and take more space while leaving you with a crippled unit. This also perfectly sets up most armies for the double turn, as they won't be tied into combat and can freely charge your valuable unit. So, how many screens should you take? Is this the blessing you need to flood the board with nothing but 360 clan rats? Well, I recommend only taking screens in armies that either A, have really good ones, or B, need screens to operate the main game plan. If I'm playing Skaven, I'm not leaving home without 1 or 2 units of clan rats or night runners. If I'm playing Disciple of Tzeentch, I am bringing some Pink Horrors to protect my big casting chickens. Some armies are absolutely just leaving screens at home though. If you aren't sure on how many, or if any, ask yourself, do I have a particular unit or game plan that needs protecting via controlled space? And, on top of that, are my screens any good in the first place? That'll help clarify how many screening units to bring to the battle. To conclude, screens exist to protect your army, and control the space to do so. However, screening units have decreased in popularity in the competitive atmosphere as more all-purpose units and cavalry have taken over the metagame. Some armies are still taking screens as they are essential to their game plan, but many armies are passing on the traditional idea of a screen. And with that, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and ring the bell, and tune in next time when we will cover the hammer archetype of unit in Warhammer, Age of Sigmar.